Okay, so that now then is basically, we've now done conditional rendering and list rendering. So that's all done now. So there's only one last little bit we need to do now on like the essential Vue.js, and that is we're going to talk about lifecycle hooks. So I think they're in here. Yeah, they are. Lifecycle diagram. Here we go. So I'm gonna refer to this lovely diagram that already exists, except it doesn't. It's tall, and so it doesn't fit on a page very well. But okay. So what we can also do, another common thing we might want to do in Vue.js. But so the last kind of essential thing that you might use on a very common basis are these lifecycle hooks. So these are functions. These are special function names that get called at certain points when the Vue application is made. So when Vue is run by the browser, it goes through and it basically sets everything up. And again, Vue.js, I may have mentioned this, but it's powered by this thing called the virtual DOM. So Vue.js has its own version of, so effectively how Vue.js is working behind the scenes is that Vue.js, when it first reads our page, because of course, stuff like v4 and note aren't valid HTML, like this little note thing here or this v4. So what Vue is doing is it's first reading through everything inside of div ID, and internally to itself, it's creating what's called a template of our application. So it's basically making its own little template of where everything works, and it's basically setting up all these like links between things, all virtually. Then what Vue.js does is that every time, again, it registers a bunch of watches, and that's when we were doing like the watch and the computed stuff, which basically listen for changes in data. And then whenever changes in data occur, it will update first the virtual DOM, and then intelligently what Vue.js will do is it will compare its virtual DOM with the actual DOM on the web page, and then check and see whether anything needs to be updated. And this is what allows Vue to be a lot faster than vanilla JavaScript, which people are often like, how is that possible that Vue.js can be faster than, no library at all? And it's because of this whole virtual DOM element. But when Vue does all these little things in its kind of process, what it will do is it will emit certain functions that allow it to do stuff that you can call if you want to run tasks at certain points in a Vue application's lifecycle. So often, you might want to run a function as soon, a common thing in jQuery was like the document.ready. Like you might want to run something as soon as the page is loaded, but you want to wait to make sure first that Vue has passed through and rendered all the stuff correctly. So that's kind of the use case of lifecycle hooks. Or you might want to trigger a function before Vue.js re-renders the page. That's also another common lifecycle hook that you might want to catch into. And so they're all kind of nicely summarized in this diagram that's here. It's kind of a messy diagram, but it is useful. So we start off with new Vue, yeah. So this gets triggered as soon as basically this is the first thing. This is the start of your application, yeah. And what Vue does first is it sets up all the backend stuff that it needs. Before Vue does anything, it calls this before create function, where it sets everything up. Then after that, Vue.js, once Vue.js gets going, it begins to start injecting itself into the page and starting to render the template that you've set up. And that's when it then calls this created method. Note that when created is run, you still don't see anything in the browser. So if you want to use like any sort of you're kind of looking for something that's document.ready. Created isn't quite it, because created still is running before the actual render has been injected into the browser. So the next thing Vue does is it checks whether it's got an element selected. So in our case, we've selected L app here. What Vue is doing is Vue is checking whether we've selected somewhere in our application to actually dump this template that we've defined for it. In our case, we have, it's called app. So it goes yes. We don't use a temp. We don't in this case use a template. It then compiles the template. But then so that does all this more magic stuff that you don't really need to worry about. These are the two important ones now. Before mount and mounted. Mounted, in my view anyway, is the function that is closest to like a document.ready. This is terrible to write with. Let's try writing with a mouse. How are we all enjoying this? Can you read that? Doc.ready. So mounted.
I think I'm gonna have nightmares about this presentation.
So doc.mounted is basically the thing that runs when Vue.js is ready to roll. At this point here, this runs after Vue.js has made sure that everything is visible on the page. So mounted, you know, if for example, if you're maybe you've got a visualization, yeah, and you want to do like a little loading bar or something, before create or created, you might want to like set the loading bar to show, and then mounted, you would at that point you would remove the loading bar. So then it's mounted, so then everything is done on the page. When data is changed, so whenever Vue.js detects a change, it will call the before update and updated functions, which again we can interact with. And then finally, when we decide that we've had enough and we want to destroy Vue, which again we won't do with our master Vue instance here, but later on we're going to define components. And remember, with our components, they effectively have their own mini Vue.js instance. So they'll all have their own copy of these lifecycle hooks. So for example, say if we're using a VIF and we've got our own mini like button component, we may want to run some code before we remove the button. And that's what these before destroy and destroyed functions are called. Again, normally read the documentation for exact specifics on which ones are called exactly when, and which ones are like the most useful and which ones you would use to solve certain problems. But that's kind of just a very, very rough outline of what each one does. As to how you'd actually, you know, how do you actually use these functions? Well, it's very simple. Each of these functions is another thing that you can add next to them. They don't go in methods. They go next to, you know, your data property. So for example, we could have in here a thing called mounted, which is a function, and we could go console.log page mounted. We could do, for example, updated function, console.log page updated. Again, these are not inside of methods. These are standalone functions that exist outside on the same level as data and L. They're not nested. We could do, you know, created Vue.js created. And I realize I've deleted that thing I had before, so I'm going to just quickly remake it. So we've got methods. And then here we have, I need to make that colon. So what did we have? We had remove index this.todo.splice dx1.
What are you doing, Rob?
I'm just remaking the method so that our list app still works, because I realized I broke it because I deleted methods because I wanted to stress these do not live inside of methods.
These do not live
So that's why I'm just adding these in. Okay, fab. Let's get rid of we don't need our do mad stuff button. I think we're satisfied with that now. So let's just put this back in here. There you go. So as you can see, the created function here, which console logs Vue.js created, runs first, and that prints out first here, as you can see. Then page mounted occurs. So that occurs after Vue.js is created, effectively. So once created has been run, VueJs internally has set everything up, but VueJs has still not rendered the content to the page. So the page isn't the content isn't rendered to the page until mounted has happened. That's just the main thing to be aware of. And then, for example, if we add a note like note, you'll see that page updated calls. Or if we remove something, page updated gets called again. Because hence both there's two symbol here. Maybe you can see. So that's basically lifecycle hooks. And they'll be used more when we start dealing with components, because when we start looking at components, we will start, we'll have things that are being added and created after our page has been loaded. Yeah. So we might want to run stuff, we might want to set stuff up as soon as the Vue component is loaded, or as soon as the Vue component is removed, or whenever the Vue component changes. So that's quite a common thing to do.
Okay.
And that's how you do it. You don't use document.ready. If I find anyone who's imported jQuery, just use document.ready. You don't want to know what's going to happen. So that's lifecycle hooks. I'm trying to think. There's something else I wanted to add on lifecycle hooks, and I can't remember what I wanted to say. And that's it. I think that's basically everything with lifecycle hooks. They're not that exciting. Read the documentation if you want to use them. Oh yeah, I mean, another use of lifecycle hooks, by the way, would be, for example, say you want to reach out to the server or a server, and you're making like a little weather application or something, and you want to fetch the data. As soon as your page loads, you want to reach out and load some data. Or whenever your component loads and you want to reach out and fetch some data, you would use mounted or created again. That's where you'd like run your function to go and fetch it. Now, of course, whenever you're doing any sort of server communication, remember I said that all that stuff is asynchronous.
Yeah.
So again, you still have the classic problem where, and this is why you might want to create loading bars and stuff. And you actually might, when we're doing visualizations and stuff, we might want to load our visualizations asynchronously so that we can put in stuff like loading bars, just because that makes everything look a bit more visual.